Easy Explain, the Empiricism of George Berkeley, starting with a little background. When he was born in Ireland in 1685, and he actually died in Oxford, England in 1753. You may have heard of Berkeley for the city in California that's named after him, but otherwise, his most famous work is a treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge, first published in 1710. And here he's really furthering his own philosophy of empiricism, which he calls immaterialism. And we're going to look at how he gets there and what exactly that means in this easy explanation. Starting with Locke, though, as this work of his is largely in response to Locke. A quick refresher on Locke, the empiricist view that understanding comes from experience, right, our sense perceptions. Locke's key phrase of tabula rasa, the mind starts as a blank slate. That's the starting point for Berkeley, and he's only going to move deeper into empiricism as he starts to develop his own immaterialism. So what does that really mean for him? We can start by looking at his key Latin phrase. He says esse est percipi, which means to be is to be perceived, meaning the material world only exists if and as it's being perceived, which seems maybe a little radical at first, but we'll see how he gets there. And if we actually break down the treatise, he does chunk it into sections, and we can take large groupings of those sections and kind of organize them thematically. So he does start with an introduction on abstract ideas. That's in response to Locke directly. He then moves into sections 1 through 33, where he focuses on building out his immaterialism. In this easy explanation, we're really going to focus on those and how he continues to advance them through his objections and replies. He does come up with his own objections, and he replies to them himself. And the consequences of immaterialism. Here, Berkeley really gets at what this could mean for mathematics, philosophy at large, religion. But again, this easy explanation, we're not going to look so much at those. We're really going to look at what Berkeley means by immaterialism. So to start with his introduction, again, this is in direct response to Locke. Locke had some things to say about abstract ideas as well, and Berkeley is largely against them. He thinks if you're having ideas in your mind, there has to at least be something particular or specific about them. He uses the example of a horse, right? If you think of the idea of a horse, at least something about that idea has something specific. The color, the length of its hair, its size, in relation to even yourself. So he says abstract ideas don't work. But now let's get into his immaterialism. Starting with section 2, Berkeley says, for the existence of an idea consists in being perceived. Moving to section 5, we get a little bit bigger of an explanation here. He says, hence as it is impossible for me to see or feel anything without an actual sensation of that thing, so is it impossible for me to conceive in my thoughts any sensible thing or object distinct from the sensation or perception of it. In truth, the object and sensation are the same thing, cannot therefore be abstracted from each other. There we go, starting to get a bit of a clearer perception of what he means by materialism. Moving into section 18, Berkeley says it remains therefore that if we have any knowledge at all of external things, it must be by reason, inferring their existence from what is immediately perceived by sense. Right, so we do have this mental faculty of reason, but it is dependent on what is being pulled into the mind by senses and perceptions of those senses. Moving into section 25, we have another rather longer one. Berkeley says, all our ideas, sensations, notions, or the things which we perceive, by whatsoever names they may be distinguished, are visibly inactive. There is nothing of power or agency included in them, so that one idea or object of thought cannot produce or make any alteration in another. To be satisfied of the truth of this, there is nothing else requisite but a bare observation of our ideas. For since they and every part of them exist only in the mind, it follows that there is nothing in them but what is perceived. All existence here is what we can perceive. Section 27, this is not directly about what his immaterialism is, but I do think it was very useful and helpful coming to terms. Me to give a slight brushstroke of what Berkeley's philosophy at large tends to start to look more like. Berkeley says a spirit is one simple undivided act of being. As it perceives ideas, it is called the understanding. As it produces or otherwise operates about them, it is called the will. Right, so for Berkeley here, we're studying what it means to understand something, what it means to act on things, and what the spirit is, not to get too religious here, but that is something Berkeley starts to build on. And finally, in section 33, Berkeley says, certainly no idea, whatever faint or strong, can exist otherwise than in a mind perceiving it. Right? If something exists, it must be perceived. Moving into his objections and replies. Again, not going to focus on those so much. We're going to keep pulling out little morsels of where he continues to advance his immaterialist philosophy, like in section 34. He says, all things that exist only in the mind, as they are pure and notional. Section 39 and 45, very much alike. In 39, he says the objects of sense exist only in the mind. And in 45, he says the objects of sense exist only when they are perceived. Right, so again, just really hammering down on for things to exist in the mind, they're based on perception. That's the only way that we know that they're real. And finally, section 78, in his objections and replies, he says, qualities, as has been shown, are nothing else but sensations or ideas, which exist only in the mind perceiving them. This is true not only of the ideas we are acquainted with at present, but likewise of all possible ideas whatsoever. And finally, to get into his consequences, Again, we're not going to look at those, but a final good note here from Berkeley in section 88. He says the very existence of an unthinking being consists in being perceived. That meaning any object that we think is an object, a material object, it only exists because we as a thinking being are perceiving it. I hope this helps to paint a brief introduction to Berkeley's materialism.